This is the second and last lecture on chapter 6 in our book. I'm going to talk about the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. The latter group eventually evolves into the Democratic Republicans. Not a great name for your political party if you're just the we're not those guys party. But the Federalists, federalism is generally understood as loose, a conglomeration of states, more power in the hands of the states and not of the federal government. That's not what the Federalists want, right? They want the opposite of that. So it's a little bit of false advertising. I just love this image in the background here. Ben Franklin, the funky founding father. I don't know why he's always the funky one. And then this was a Philly cheesesteak place, so obviously Philadelphia got to have the cheese steaks. And then it was run by a Korean family, so I don't know, bukane, I don't know what that means. I remembered at one point, but I've forgotten. Something like, I don't know, delicious or something like that. Anyway, how to constitute a new nation, right? A constitution is different from a confederation. There's a reason the Confederacy is the Confederacy when they secede and try to start their own little slave-based nation. There's a reason why they're the Confederacy. It's a loose conglomeration. But more on them later. So this is what it is. You have the Articles of Confederation. They're populist documents. The Federalist Constitution, right? The Constitutional Convention is packed with Federalists. They get their way. And then they get 40 years of anti-Federalist populism. People don't like the Federalists. A lot of people didn't like the idea of the Constitution, and they pay. When John Adams is elected after Washington, he proves right all of the fears of the anti-Federalists. He's a tin pot dictator, wants to be a monarch, passes all of this legislation that upends civil liberties. Well, he's a one-termer, and you get two-term Jefferson, two-term Madison, two-term Monroe. You get a little blip with another Adams, John Quincy, and then you have 2 terms of Jackson. None of these two-termers like the Federalists. The Federalists are a minority party. They're not popular. They're just, largely cater to the elite in the Northeast. But they'll control the courts, and they control the courts for a very long time, so they can their ideas stick around until they're reborn as the Whigs. More on that later. Okay, so this is right. To all to whom, blah blah blah. This is the Articles of Confederation. What is the anti-federalist plan? Just don't go to Philadelphia, right? Some people are not around. Jefferson is off in France, but others just don't go. They boycott the Constitutional Convention, and they get what they get. We went over this in class. This is the classic idea, the classic conception of different kinds of government. At the Constitutional Convention, they're trying to go for this. They got a little bit of too much of this with Daniel Shays and them. Rebelling. The Federalists are very much interested in this, getting a little closer to this. Anti-Federalists are okay here. Your executive, right? Don't want a tyrant. Okay. So what do? A couple of plans. Again, it's a self-selecting group, so they actually have an easier time pushing forward a Federalist agenda, because there's no John Hancock, there's no Patrick Henry. Jefferson, again, is not there either because he's in Paris. He is not boycotting, but he's serving an official position in Paris. So they get what they want a lot or more easily. Okay, so the Federalist plan is based on the Virginia plan. This is also known as the Big State plan. Big population in Virginia. Madison proposes this. It is a bicameral legislature. That means 2 chambers, right? Bicameral is 2 chambers. An upper chamber or upper house, a lower chamber or lower house, which is elected by the people. This is the demos, right? This is the popular representation one. And then you have an upper house that is selected by the lower house from candidates named by state legislatures. If that sounds complicated, it's because it is. As I mentioned, the idea of the upper house is that you're going to have an aristocratic cast to this, right? So you don't want the hoi polloi, the mudsills, the ne'er-do-wells, the poor people voting here. You want to elevate your game a little bit. People don't like it. This is actually, it's around till 1913 is the 17th Amendment, which changes it. And then we get direct election of senators. That's something that the progressive and populist era was demanding in the 1880s, 90s, 19-teens. So they finally get it. And keep that in mind here. Something that we're going to chart over the course of the year is who are the populists, who are the people saying more power in the hands of the people, and who is the enemy. For the anti-federalists, the enemy is big government. By the time you get to the 19-teens, it's changed a little bit, and they're actually calling on big government to step in to check the power of big business. Big businesses in this time period. Okay. Legislature can nullify any state law that violates the Constitution, right? So if you're some state and you pass some law that's against the Constitution, you can nullify it. Representation based on population, that is the big sticking point, right? And this is why this is the big state plan. Big states like it. You have an executive. They can veto acts of Congress. It's not really clear on what an executive means. It's an executive branch. This is not like, I'm an executive. This is the executive branch. It could have been several people. They end up being one. They end up not having term limits, although Washington sets a precedent by stepping down after 2. And then you have a judiciary. Supreme judges or Supreme Court, and then inferior courts. This setup, there's a lot of so you've got the aristocracy, democracy, you've got that whole balance, the mixed government balance. Then you have, right, the bicameral legislature, upper house, lower house. And then, of course, you have what would have then been known as a tripartite division of government by the legislature, the executive, and the judicial. As your book, God bless it, book points out, Montesquieu. And I'll talk about that in a second, largely inspired by the French Enlightenment thinker Montesquieu. Okay, so there's a problem here. Small states don't like it, right? Small states are not happy. There's no way. Representation based on population, there's no way. We're not signing up for it. They come up with a compromise known as the Connecticut Compromise. They say, okay, we get a little bit of both. We'll get a little bit of the New Jersey plan, or the small state plan, a little bit of the Virginia plan, also known as the big state plan, and we'll mix it all together, get a compromise. The lower house, the House of Representatives, will be based on population. This appeases the large state plan. But the upper house will be 2 senators from each state. This is the small state idea, right? So you get a bicameral legislature that gets a little bit of both, little big state, little small state. And it makes everyone happy. Slavery, this is one they don't sort out. It's related to representation, right? I'll have a couple quotes from Governor Morris and South Carolina's Pinckney, Representative Pinckney, at the end of the lecture, which get to this point, right? It's all about representation. If these people are being counted as people for representational purposes, then let them vote, right? How can you count them, give them rights, right? If they're property, then why should they be able to vote, right? The houses of Philadelphia can't vote, right? Cows can't vote, wagons can't vote, all these other kinds of property. They don't sort it out. It's a deal breaker. It is a deal breaker. 74 years later with the Civil War. And then the last sticking point is the power of the executive. How much power should the executive have? Right. Again, all of these guys are fearful of too much power in one person's hands. Federalists are a little more okay with power in the hands of an executive. Anti-federalists, obviously not so much. Contemporary issues with big state, small state. For us in California, this is relevant. 40 million people represented by 2 senators, where you have these other states also 40 million people represented by 30 senators. So with respect to small state, big state, these issues are still very much with us. We haven't really sorted out how to fix it yet. Electoral college is a whole other thing that has to do with elections. This is about representation, right, in Congress, right? How what do we think about this? It's certainly not equal, right? It's certainly not equal. Okay. How do you sell the Constitution? Here's the Baron of Montesquieu. Montesquieu is cited by the Federalists in his discussion of the separation of powers, executive, legislative, judicial, right? And then they check each other up. So Montesquieu is, the Federalists are a fan of Montesquieu. The Anti-Federalists also are a fan of Montesquieu. Montesquieu is one of the kind of premier Enlightenment neoclassical writers writing about ancient Rome and how awesome it was and how we should aspire to those virtues in a modern republic. Well, this is how Montesquieu talks about it, right? To love democracy is to love frugality. Democracy ought to provide everyone with the same happiness and the same advantages, the same pleasures and the same expectations. This can be done only by frugality on the part of all. You think those elite merchant class from Boston and New York like this idea? You think the Federalists like this idea? No. This is something that appeals to a Spartan, stripped down understanding of Republican virtue that would have been more popular to yeoman farmers, people like Thomas Jefferson, and others who are very much keen on replicating a kind of stripped down Spartan Republican form of governance, not the ostentation and the wealth that the Federalists are more okay with, right? It's not a political idea; it's more of an economic idea. But there's a serious division here, right? Both citing Montesquieu for very different ends. Federalist papers, we make much of them. Fed 10, and they're good, right? The Fed 10 in particular is the most famous one. There's a bunch of them, right? Yes, Hamilton wrote a bunch of them. Outside of New York, how influential were they? They're in all American history textbooks now, but they're really just convinced people in New York. And that's about it. Anti-Federalists, they are afraid of tyrannical power. A strong centralized government is more inclined to be able to get you to that tyrannical stage. As any anti-Federalist well knows, it just takes one bad ruler. The democratic project, the idea of a republic based on virtue is very tenuous. It is very fragile. And it just takes one leader operating in bad faith to wreck the whole thing, right? It doesn't matter how much equity you've built up. One bad leader, one self-serving or self-interested leader, and the whole thing is shot. So they don't want to have a federal government with a lot of power. They want a loose confederation of small republics, more like I don't know, is it like the Delian League or something? Or like the ancient Mayan civilizations, as opposed to a unified, centralized power. Okay, Federalists win. Sorry, they don't show up, the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, even then, it's still a hot debate, right? So you can imagine, right? None of the people that are dead set against this idea, they're not even there. So you have hardline Federalists, moderates, and then people who are kind of lukewarm on the idea. And it's still really close, right? So you can imagine had the Anti-Federalists been there, it would have been a very different kind of conversation. They make amends, as it were, by adding amendments to the end of the Constitution. This is known as the Bill of Rights. Because we're not an AP Gov class, our textbook has a paltry 1 paragraph on the Bill of Rights, but it's important, and I've made much of it in all of my lectures about the Revolutionary period and how it's not like the Founding Fathers were some time travelers moving into the 21st century saying, oh, they're going to need this and they're going to need that. Yeah, they were forward thinking. They wanted to create a document that was durable and that would last. But a lot of these amendments, the first 10 amendments being the Bill of Rights, the ones they come up with right away, they're inspired by the colonial period, right? Freedom of speech and freedom of the press, that's the Zenger case. That is the print culture of the Revolutionary period, the printing presses, being against the Stamp Act, which you had to pay a tax for all that printed material. Freedom of religion, obviously this one goes way back. And then freedom of assembly and freedom to petition your government for redress of grievances. All of the conventions that they're holding, all of the demonstrations that they're having, all of the purposeful crowd actions, right? Freedom of assembly and freedom to petition your government for redress of grievances, very important to the founders, right? That's the first. People always, freedom of speech, freedom of speech. They don't, like, there's a lot of other stuff baked into the First Amendment, some of which we don't talk about, and unfortunately, there are civil liberties that have been well eroded, primarily freedom of assembly and freedom to petition your government for redress of grievances. I mean, forget it. Those rights don't exist anymore. You really don't. The hoops you have to jump through to assemble or to petition your government for redress of grievances, yeah, forget it. Sorry, Thomas Jefferson. Second Amendment, this is Lexington and Concord. This is about a well-regulated militia, right? It's in the Second Amendment. It's not about hunting. This is something where contemporary debates about the Second Amendment often don't want to go there. The idea of the Second Amendment is to overthrow the government. The idea of the Second Amendment is that you don't need a standing army. You don't need a police force. You can muster troops and have an army. You can police your own communities. And that is what the Second Amendment is about. It's not about, quail hunting. The Third Amendment, quartering of soldiers. This is not a terribly controversial one. First two often are. You don't see many cases being pressed against the Third Amendment, although it did come up recently in the news that I think that National Guard or federal troops were being housed in Washington, D.C. in a hotel, and they were from Utah or something, and someone would say, that they're being, right, this is quartering of soldiers in this, I think with private, right, obviously, establishment. Anyway, nothing came of it. Fourth Amendment, arrests, search and seizure. This is writs of assistance, a legal search and seizure, a hot topic in the colonial era, rights of persons accused of crimes. 5, 6, 7, and 8 all have very specific ways of approaching the law and your rights, right, for jury trial, a speedy trial, not having too much bail set. This is admiralty courts. This is the kind of judicial system that was propped up by royal governors that colonists thought was unfair. All of that. 9, rights kept by the people. So just because the Constitution doesn't say it's a positive right doesn't mean you don't have a positive right. And then the states retain powers, right? So that's the Bill of Rights. We can talk more about it in class. It's kind of important. But again, Bill of Rights' first 10 amendments. It's to pacify some of the more anti-federalist sentiments. They punt on slavery in 2 ways. Article 1, Section 9. This effectively bans the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. Migration or importations of such persons as any states now existing. Okay, they don't say slavery, but God bless it. If you ever talk to someone and they say, well, the Constitution doesn't actually use the word slave or slavery, and therefore nah, man, no. NO, non-starter, not even a debate. They know it's slavery. They're talking about slavery. Article 1, Section 9 is about slavery. Article 1, Section 2 is about slavery. It's all about slavery. Various reasons why they didn't include it. Some people in the North didn't want it there because they were abolitionists and they thought it was a disgusting practice. They were right. Some people in the South didn't want it because they didn't want to use the term because they were highfalutin Southerners. And they were wrong. Article 1, Section 2 is about the taxing and apportionment of representatives. So if you look through it, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to respective numbers, which shall be determined adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed. So that would be like not Native Americans, yes, indentured servants, they count, and 3/5 of all other persons. So this is the infamous 3/5 clause, which is about representation. So not 100% representation, not 0% representation, 3/5. This identifies enslaved Africans as 3/5 of 100% human. It is the 3/5 compromise, not the 2/5 compromise. So it is it favors Southern states, even though they would rather have the, obviously the 5/5 compromise. They got 3 and not 2. Governor Morris, he's not the governor of Pennsylvania. His name is governor. He says, as I pointed out earlier, on what grounds, right? If they're men, if they're people, then they should be citizens. They give them a vote. If they're property, what other property in the world, gets this vote, right? And he kind of throws the shade at South Carolina. All the houses in Philadelphia are worth more than all the wretched slaves which cover the rice swamps of South Carolina. Right. Which is it? Which is it? Which is it going to be? On the other hand, Charles Pinckney, South Carolina, uses the appeal to tradition fallacy in his argument. People have always had slaves, so that means it's okay. That is a logical fallacy. It is always wrong. Sorry, Charles Pinckney. It was wrong in 1787. It's wrong now. It's appealed to tradition. But, right, the Southerners think that they're high-toned. They think that they're inheriting, right, the traditions of Greece and Rome. Northern Republicans do too, but they can take out the slavery bit. Not so in the South. He adds... Pinckney is largely responsible for Article 4, Section 2, which is the fugitive slave law, right? So escaped enslaved people, right, have to be shipped back to the state. This becomes an increasingly problematic issue in the years leading up to the Civil War. Northern states protest this on the grounds of states' rights, right? So they say, look, if someone in New York is free, if Black Americans are free in New York and someone shows up in New York, they're free, and they're a citizen and they pay taxes or they have a job. Who is some, bounty hunter from South Carolina to come up and pull them, send them back to slavery, right? So people complain about this. This is nullified by the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. Give the devil his due here. Pinckney is also responsible for Article 6, Section 3, which is no religious tests should be required for qualifications of any public office. So, he's wrong on the slavery thing, but he did right by the separation of church and state. Jefferson was also a huge advocate of the separation of church and state. And that is all. That is the Constitutional Convention. We got a constitution. We got a country. Let's see what happens next time.